welcome Adam Cole. Over to you, Adam.
Thank you very much.
I'll just say hello to everybody, and there'll be more people joining us as we go along, and we're delighted to have Adam Cole and some people that we haven't seen in a while who's joining us this morning. Okay, Adam.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here and for inviting me to the Help with Helpers meeting. I'm Adam Cole. I'm a performance and confidence coach in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm going to share my screen with you now. The name of this presentation is called The Problem Solving Problems, and there's several meanings to that. One is the problem with solving problems, one is the problem of solving problems, and one is the kind of problems that can solve other problems. So there's lots of meanings embedded in there. I'm going to try to go pretty quickly because I have a lot of information to cover. If you find this is too much, you can reread the entire presentation at acole.net. That's my website, and you'll find the link in the chat, and also we'll go over it at the end. I am a ferocious problem solver. I turn everything into a problem to be solved. I can systematically break that problem down and work at it for years and even decades. This is something I've learned about myself that is new. Now, when I find a problem that I cannot see a way into, I sometimes shut down. And this is why, despite knowing lots about math and loving it, I shut down as soon as I read a word problem. I have the same response to running out of time, running out of money, and anything that does not readily lend itself to a problem-solving mentality. And when I do shut down, my shutdowns generate anxiety and depression in me, and it's hard for me to break the problem up and tackle it in pieces the way I should. And that's why, just as part of survival for me, learning to solve the problem of solving problems has been my life's work. Here are some problems I have solved in my life. How to learn a second language, how to think about calculus, how to write orchestration. And I'm going to talk about each of those things now. A great way to solve problems is to break them up into smaller, more manageable problems. And in fact, the bigger problem becomes exactly how to break them up into what size, what is the problem that is small enough to manage but big enough to engage you. No one wants to write a novel at the rate of 1 letter a day. So let's look at some of the problems I've solved. We'll start with the language problem. After a lifetime of trying to learn a language and a lifetime of failing, I've finally begun making progress in Italian after just 6 years. The ice broke about a year ago and was the result of a lot of little steps. The next time I learn a language, I'll have a much better route. I started off by throwing as much grammatical and vocabulary information at myself as possible in the space of a year, and this created a problem of too much information that was not well connected. This points to a deeper problem. Because of my fluency and even my expertise in writing English, I was naturally very good at writing and speaking even as a child. My expectations were too high for another language. Not only was it intolerable for me to speak and write like a beginner, I didn't really ever have to overcome the same difficulties in English. Once I broke my tasks into manageable goals with distinct progress, I finally began integrating the information I had swallowed whole. What is essential is to make connections between the information learned, to make what you learn useful and integrated, however rudimentary that is, and to continually build upon it. This is how successful language study courses go, and is much closer to the way we actually learn a language. Now, I love math, but I have always struggled. I spent 30 years slowly working through this textbook about calculus by a man named George Simmons. This is like my calculus Bible. And over time, as I've paid attention to my improvement, I've been able to understand how I made progress and why. And that's been more interesting to me than the math itself. Over time, I've gotten better, but never great at math. I'm kind of like the guy that could tell you everything you need to know about a Chopin etude, but can't play the etude. That's me with math. I'm really not any good at it, but I do know things about math. One thing math requires is a complete connection between all parts of an idea. Each sentence in a math textbook, each line of a proof or explanation must be understood from the smallest detail up. If there's any confusion or break in the continuity of these ideas, the learner will be derailed. We can be derailed in foreign languages with a word we don't recognize, but the syntax can usually save us. For instance, in English, if I said, I was too tired to glue to the store, you can probably figure out what glue means just from the context. But with math, it's really hard to infer that missing piece. It's got to be understood as part of a complete picture. Often a problem relies on every detail in the explanation, and this can be miserable for the math learner. I had several barriers to overcome. The first was a physical barrier, an inability to scan freely with my eyes from left to right, making it hard just to read complete sentences. Through the Feldenkrais method, I was able to greatly improve this. Once I improved my vision sufficiently, then I had to do the work of coordinating the details with the big picture. Reading a math explanation may require holding certain ideas in your head while receiving others, just like when you listen to a sentence. You may not even be aware of this, but you don't take in each word of a sentence. You take in the whole sentence, and then you start sorting what words are important and what words are less important. And you have to do this with math as well. In the case of math, the bar is higher, and the need for focused, knowledgeable concentration is greater. I began discovering what kinds of things I needed to hold in my head, what kinds of things were constant and what were changing. I learned how to better transform words into ideas and pictures that moved around. In short, I learned how to connect the ideas into coherent wholes. Now, the subject of orchestration is pretty rare. Most people don't know anything about it. I hope this is interesting to you. I used to get so frustrated trying to write for the orchestra. I could hear music in my head, and I would write great pieces for the piano or to sing, but I couldn't hear orchestral music in my head, and I didn't understand why. The basic ideas of orchestration seemed to elude me. When I listened to orchestral pieces, I felt like I didn't know what I was hearing. Does this sound familiar? It was the same problem I was having with foreign language. And when I studied orchestral scores with my eyes, I didn't know what to look at. I lacked a schema for taking apart the notation to understand what I was seeing. This was a similar problem I was having when I looked at math. Over a long period of time, I came to understand and integrate enough of the small details of orchestration, just like I did with language and math, to be able to prioritize what was more important and what was less important on the page. Being able to prioritize the information made me a smarter viewer of the page, which to the uninitiated is just a big wash of notes. The better I got at seeing it, the better I got at hearing it, because surprisingly, my eyes are better at dissecting a visual mess than my ears are dissecting an oral one. Although I should point out my ears are actually far better than most people's in that regard. And it's probably no coincidence that because my ears were very good, I found it harder to do the necessary work to get good at a skill I wasn't already good at, just like language and just like math. So I want to summarize the problems I was having with all three of these disciplines. First, I had difficulty knowing how much information to learn in order to gain a mastery of a particular concept. I would usually either learn too much or too little. Second, I had difficulty prioritizing the learning, knowing what was more important and what was less important. Third, I had difficulty integrating the learning, connecting the information I had. This was a result of the last two problems. All three of the scenarios I gave you, plus others like playing jazz, drawing, and writing novels, short stories, and songs, they all required the same sort of learning curve for me, and I put in the same 30 years for all of them. As a compulsive problem solver, I suspected that there was a constant running through all of these problems, and that if I was going to solve one of them, I might be able to solve them all. What I didn't suspect was that the constant was deeper than I thought, but I'm going to get to that in a little while. One of the best strategies for solving problems is to break it up into smaller, more manageable pieces. Sometimes the issue is that the problem can't be broken into pieces that are the right size. You'd like to break the problem up, but when you do, you're either dealing with information that by itself doesn't mean anything, like if I just said let x equal 7 and didn't say anything else, that doesn't mean anything to you, or you're dealing with a glut of things that you can't make sense of. Like, hey, here's the proof to why the square root of 2 is irrational. It's just too much for you. You're not going to be able to get it unless you are a mathematician. Elements needed to solve the problem are interrelated, and they shine light upon one another. All the elements have to be understood in order to make sense of any one of them. For example, a word cannot be made sense of by looking only at its letters. The combination of letters must be taken into account, as well as the context of the word. There's a woman named Jean Bamberger who came up with two brilliant concepts to describe this. She said the unit of perception and the unit of description. The larger idea is the unit of perception, and the smaller ideas inside of it are the units of description. We get into trouble when we reach the limit of how far we can meaningfully break down a problem. The units of description become too small for us to perceive them. How can we solve this problem? I'm going to pose a riddle to all of you. This isn't hard, but I do open it up for you to answer if you have an answer. I want you to imagine you have a box of 2,000 Legos, and they're on a stage on the right, and you have to carry the Legos from one end of the stage to the other in a single trip. That's easy if they're in a box, but I'm going to take away the box, and now there's a big pile of Legos on the floor. How can you get the Legos carried across the stage in a single trip? Does anybody want to proffer an answer?
Connect up the Legos, connect up all the Legos into one piece.
Thank you. As I said, not a terribly difficult riddle. Yes, the Legos can be connected. Absolutely. The Legos link together, and by linking them all, they can be carried in a single trip, and they can be linked in lots of ways, some creating a more efficient package than others. Like if you put them all in a single column going way up to the sky, that might be transportable, but it would be very fragile and unwieldy and maybe too tall for the room. Problems are often like these Legos. You can think of the box as a person or a book that has the solution for us so we don't have to solve it. But if you take away the box, it puts us in the problem-solving learning space. We can solve the problem by linking the Legos, that is, linking the elements of the problem into a meaningful whole. Legos are easy to connect. Elements of a problem are not always so easy. One of the difficulties of problem solving is that we don't always understand how the elements fit together. And I'm going to give you another example. And again, I'm going to ask you to participate. This is a little harder. I'm going to show you a series of numbers. And I'm going to give you 10 seconds to memorize them. Go. Five seconds. And time's up. Okay, how many of you think you could reproduce those numbers on a piece of paper? Any of you? What if I added some other numbers to confuse you, like 741 and 931 and 338? Now, can you remember those numbers at all? It's pretty hard. What about 5 minutes from now, a year from now? What if I told you that there's an actually easy way to remember all those numbers forever? You're never going to ever not know those 10 numbers again. Here's the solution. Does anybody have a solution? I'm sorry.
I do.
What is it?
They're all squares.
Very good. We have a math person. in the house. So 21 times 21 is 441. 22 times 22 is 484. That's right. If you can memorize the numbers between 21 and 30, you've got this forever. And very few of you are going to forget how to remember 21 through 30, and everyone knows how to do this. So there you can remember these numbers easily because you know how to connect them. The solution to this problem is kind of trivial, but the idea behind it is very helpful. Any problem can be addressed by thinking of the elements not as individual units to be conquered, but as individual elements to be linked and connected meaningfully. This is why it can be much easier to memorize more information than less information. Do you want to learn the names of all your coworkers? You can map out how they're related to one another socially and functionally and sort them into age groups, gender groups, zodiacs, or anything that's meaningful to you. Then you'll have a composite picture of all the people in your group rather than a collection of individuals. Do you want to learn to orchestrate like I did? Understand how the elements of the orchestra combine to solve the problem of enhancing or creating a piece of music. Start with the music and then figure out how to orchestrate it. That music will take you from the arbitrary rules of instrumentation into a thought process that's reasonable and replicable. Do you want to learn math? It's harder, but the solution's the same. Understand how a group of math facts connect through proofs, problems, and applications and that will illuminate all of them. One of the mysterious things about problems and miraculous things is that sometimes the elements can be linked by something unrelated to the elements. In some cases, you actually can be able to solve a problem in an unexpected way. Let's say the problem is making sure little kids are ready to do math when they get to elementary school. Now, some people solve this problem in a terrible way. They foist math skills on poor little children who are 3 and 4 years old and aren't developmentally ready for them. This is currently being done by well-meaning educators, legislators, and parents. And what it really does is it makes children neurotic, and it robs them of the playtime they need to grow into competent learners. But check out this interesting way to teach children about math. There's a children's song called By and By, and it goes like this. By and by, star shining, number 1, number 2, number 3, oh my. By and by, oh my. By and by. It continues, by and by, star shining, number 4, number 5, number 6, oh my. And it goes on, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. What's remarkable is that a 3-year-old child can actually learn this song and memorize it. And because the child has to be able to subdivide the numbers into 3 groups in order to sing and memorize the song, they are actually solving the problem of grouping numbers into 3. They don't know they're solving this problem. Many music teachers don't know they're solving this problem, but they can't sing the song without solving the problem. So you are teaching children how to divide 9 by 3 by teaching them a song. This connects the math. I have an even more fun example. How many of you know the song Bingo? There was a farmer, had a dog, and Bingo was his name. Oh, B-I-N-G-O, 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 and Bingo was his name. Oh, there was a farmer, had a dog, and Bingo was his name. Oh, I-N-G-O, I-N-G-O, and so forth until you replace all the letters with claps. What you're actually doing here is you're setting children up to learn algebra because you're replacing letters with claps. You're asking them, how many claps do you need as we progress in the song? They're actually solving little equations by singing this song. So you are teaching children fascinating and important math foundations without taking them through math. You're connecting information for them through music. So I have done a more involved version of this presentation specifically about math, and it's on my website, and you can find it if you'd like to take a little more time to investigate this. So the Lego problem, let's go back to that. It could have been solved with many trips, but we wouldn't have solved the bigger problem, which is getting them across in a single go. We needed connection to solve that problem. I want to tell you about another one of my issues. I had trouble with jazz solos my entire life. I am a professional jazz musician, but soloing was the thing I could not figure out how to do, even with tons of teachers. Now, I figured out October 29th of this year, I finally solved the jazz solo problem to my satisfaction. I'm not saying I'm great at jazz soloing, but I finally understood what the problem was. I used to see jazz solos as threading out ideas on a string, like here's a note, here's a note, here's a note. What are the notes I can play? This worked as long as I kept it slow, but I didn't know why that was true. When it went fast, I just fell apart. Instead, I discovered that jazz solos are actually made up of phrases, just like our language phrases, like that's the way the ball bounces. If you try to talk to someone in Italian and you explain that's the way the ball bounces, you have to explain the whole concept of that phrase to them. They won't understand each individual word of it. They'll understand what the whole phrase means. Just like you don't understand what each individual word means, you just listen to the whole thing. Jazz solos are like that. They're phrases to be understood in their entirety. The speaker or the player must have a complete understanding of the phrase backwards and forwards, not just sequentially, but actually integrated in order to know that it will fit with other phrases. It's a kind of mathematical mindset. The rationale for why one phrase will work and another will not, now that's a matter of art, not science. But decisions about solos have to be made with a kind of precision of knowledge and experience that when it's lacking will result in confusion and ineffective performance. It took me so long to solve this problem because I was always trying to break the solo down into individual notes, and those notes didn't make any sense by themselves. I lacked the capacity to know exactly what size bytes to break the problem into. Had I known, I'd have had something that would have connected well to each phrase before and after, and to the music as a whole. I want to talk about the Feldenkrais method here. Possibly the most profound means of addressing the problem came in my studies of the method. The somatic discipline provides us a means to examine how we function as humans by taking us through lessons designed to improve our awareness both of our physical positions in space and our habitual responses to movement. The method of waking us up to the difference between what we desire to do and what we actually do involves this question of enacting our knowledge with a sufficiently effective problem. In one form of the method, Feldenkrais created awareness through movement lessons, or ATMs. There are hundreds of these lessons, and while they vary greatly in the specific instructions, they share a larger structure. They are pre-thought out problems. Typically, the lessons focus on a function involving reaching, twisting, or folding the body. There's usually an opportunity to assess one's functionality by doing what appears to be an arbitrary movement, such as reaching across one's body with the hand to feel the ribs on the opposite side. Over the course of 45 minutes, the participant will have an opportunity to see if they've increased the extent or ease of this movement without making an additional effort. The magic result of improvement seen at the end of these lessons may come about from the method of the lesson. The instructions ask us to enact our movement while constraining us in ways that prevent us from doing it in our habitual manner. For example, we may be asked to cross our left leg over our right before reaching across our body, making it difficult. This contrived request may constrain our ability to rotate in the pelvic region. This presents us with a problem. If we're going to be able to reach our ribs, we have to soften them enough that we can rotate from higher up than the pelvis. We may have to go very slowly and pay careful attention to ourselves before it occurs to us that our ribs can move. In this way, though we deem ourselves experts at the use of our bodies, we come to discover that there are parts of us with which we are completely unfamiliar, perfectly functional muscles and bones that can move, but to which we have no connection in our minds. We gain access to these little boxes inside ourselves when we have to solve the problem of the lesson. We may need to spend considerable amounts of time relearning or learning for the first time the movement in these ribs which we might have suppressed for our entire lives before we can adequately make use of it to turn without the assistance of the hips and pelvis. Feldenkrais was very good at breaking a function up into pieces while maintaining a sense of the connection through the whole body. At no point is a lesson ever divorced from the whole self. This is the difference between one of his lessons and one we might just make up. Once we finish the lesson and experience the sensation of increased freedom and comfort that ensues when formerly unidentified parts of ourselves are integrated into our self-image, we have another level to go. If we fail to make use of our improved function of turning, we will lose it. We must have a use for our restored talents in order to gain true expertise. In my case, one of the best uses of my freedom was the study of the piano. Like so many other areas, I found myself unable to become the pianist I thought I should be or could be. I had little notion of what was different between myself, an inspired, curious music lover, and my friends who studied piano at the Oberlin Conservatory of Music and were just great. Even with the assistance of 5 piano teachers in the course of my life, including the 3 jazz teachers mentioned before, I found my progress to be fitful and far from satisfying. But then again, despite my instruction, I avoided actually performing, especially in my early formative years. This proved to be an important point. The method, the Feldenkrais method, which I began studying in my late 20s in piano lessons, which I took on and off until my late 30s, did not combine to meaningfully improve my playing. Only finding a suitable challenge did that. And one of the most effective challenges was working a church job. Forced to play new music every week, some of it considerably difficult, I quickly had to enact the skills I had cultivated but not organized. I saw my best improvement when I was working for a church as a professional accompanist. Incorporating my Feldenkrais improvements proved more difficult and required an even greater challenge. That came about when I began teaching the piano. Having to guide my students through the same difficulties I experienced forced me to integrate my knowledge with my capability. The better my students got, the better I got, until at last I achieved what I considered to be a normal ability to perform on the piano. Here are several problems I have not solved. How to throw. How to draw clouds in pen and ink. How to earn lots of money. Despite what I know, these problems still evade me. I'm less anxious about them now because I've learned the above ideas. I also recently had a revelation that proved very helpful, and I want to tell you that story now. And this is the big focus. Over the course of 54 years, I've had every opportunity to heal from the things that harmed me. I've done talk therapy and completely processed the kind of things that happened in my childhood. My work with the Feldenkrais method and intermittent fasting has restored my body and mind to a better, more functional state. And yet at 54, I was finding myself reaching a point of despair. I was still having panic attacks, still unable to reach clarity in my thoughts, still finding myself moving along the same irrational paths where I would pursue too many things at once under the assumption that I could master them all given enough time and information. I continued to have flawed and confusing interactions with my wife and children where I would act or say hurtful things that to me hadn't seemed hurtful when I said them. Getting feedback on those interactions was like being blind and walking through a room where someone is moving the chairs around, or where you come back to your office and someone has moved everything around so that nothing's where you thought it should be. Yet I knew I was healed from my trauma. I knew it from the evidence of years of therapy, and I felt it in my heart. So why wasn't I better? Now, I have an interview show on YouTube called TruerMU, and I had a guest on my show named Sam Farmer. We'd gone to college together, and he'd discovered many years later at age 40 that he was on the autism spectrum. Even though I knew I could never be diagnosed as on the autism spectrum myself at this point, it was through our conversation that I began to accept the possibility that I am neurodivergent within a brain that is wired differently from most people. I began to look back at my life on all the problems I'd had, problems with friendships, problems with intimacy and relationships, problems with anxiety, and just like the Legos, I found myself connecting all these problems. Once I did, I saw them as a single thing for the first time in my life, and I could carry them. Once I started thinking about the possibility that I was neurodivergent, all the cards fell into place. The troubles I'd had as a kid, the weirdness, the wonderfulness, the superpowers, and the super fails all sounded very much like someone with a different neuropathy. Even better, it gave me a sense of how I might think of myself now. As a neurodivergent person, I could recognize that there was nothing wrong with me, no damage to carry, nothing to fix. I was simply a person living in a world designed for minds that weren't like mine. I was bound to have anxiety in that kind of world, and it would never completely go away. The difference between thinking I should be anxiety-free versus knowing that anxiety is a part of my neuropathy changes me from feeling like a failure to a person who is different. Furthermore, it gives me the opportunity to directly address my difficulties. Up to now, I've been shooting at my anxiety and missing every time because, in effect, the rifle sights have been off. What I thought was a bullseye was a miss every time. Now I understand that knowing my triggers will help me deal with the anxiety, but that the triggers themselves are not symptoms or weaknesses. They are the results of my different brain colliding with the world. Instead of liabilities, the triggers are now friends who will help me move through the danger, recognize when I'm overwhelmed, and give me an opportunity to do the hard work I have to do to get through it. That someone else doesn't have to deal with these triggers is no longer a sign of my inferiority in society, just a sign of my differences with other people. I get superpowers and I get super triggers, and for better or worse, it's all me. When my wife lets me know that I am being hurtful or insensitive, or tells me that my experience of something like working with money could be different, I have the opportunity to recognize that I have a choice. She can help me describe the connections that I and my fractured mental state may be missing. And rather than get defensive, I can trust her and others in my life and begin to learn the things that other people know without trying. It doesn't bother me to have to learn them. I found that being forced to learn the things that other people do automatically gives me an insight into them that many people miss. For all the extra years I have to spend on something, at the end of the process, I am not only an expert, but I can teach it. This change in outlook gives me an opportunity to replace self-despite with self-love. It gives me the opportunity to fill the empty place inside myself where an identity could never be found. No longer do I have to seek ways to externalize my identity with creations so that I can feel safe. I have an identity. I am a person. My creations are the result of that person, and they look and sound like that person with all his neurodivergence. If that makes it harder for me to connect with people, then this is a challenge and an opportunity. The point is, now I know what that challenge and opportunity are. Once I realized that I had a new problem to solve, which I'm in the middle of now, what do I do to connect all my little problems? What's the new big problem I want to solve? What can I do as the person I am? And maybe I'll know more about that the next time I speak to you. In conclusion, I want to say that I've been trying to solve the me problem my whole life, and arguably I chose my obsession with problems I couldn't solve in math, orchestration, and language studies because while they seemed unsolvable, they were at least problems that I recognized. They kept me distracted until I was finally able to solve the me problem. Working on those other problems forced me eventually to see the similarities between them, that each one required an integration of units of description into something large enough for me to perceive, and the further connection of those elements with one another. Ultimately, my ability to solve those problems made it possible for me to solve the me problem. When I finally solved the me problem, it was because I could see enough of me to register and could connect the various aspects of myself into a unified whole. I've covered a lot of information very quickly. Again, my website is www.acol.net. And if you have trouble reaching it, you can contact me at adam@acol.net, and I would be happy to connect you. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Adam. Wow. I'm just going to get my gallery view here and see what comes in any of us. That was quite a voyage.
It has been.
Maybe I'll start by saying that I think maybe solving the me problem is all of our human problem, and all the other problems are expressions of that problem, and that maybe we're all, as you discovered, different. And I'd love to hear from people about that. How are you with the me problem, with other problems? Does it help to discover that we're not pathological, we're unique, we're different, that our minds are different than other minds?
When there's a me, there's always a problem. When there's no me, there's no problem.
When there's a me, there's always a problem.
Taking things personally. But when there's no me, and seeing myself as a process, as a function, instead of an entity as a content, then things are just changing and in flux. And so there's no problem because things change. Things doesn't always remain the same.
When you take your personal attachment and needs and cares out of the picture, there's no problem. The problem is the connections and how it's going, investments, and all the things that make us human, make us problemed.
Yes, the attachment, like being hooked by the thought. Like earlier on, I saw a text. I saw a text from a colleague. Then immediately a thought is like, oh, what's going to happen? That's going to be a meeting, blah, blah. But all these are fabrication. They are just something that's being conditioned by my past experience with some other colleagues. But as I recognize all these are thoughts and they are fabrications, are stories that are not aligned with the reality, then it's like, okay, there's no problem. The problem is I was attached to the content of the thoughts. And perceive that it's going to happen. And I come back and anchor myself to the present hey, all these are thoughts, and recognizing that these are conditioned by my past experience, and therefore it arises, and it arises because it's a natural phenomenon, because it's not something that's controlled by me, and it just arises. And so I like this saying, whatever has the nature of arising has the nature of ceasing. And with that in mind, it just kind of relate to the idea like no self, no problem, because things are just like in flux, including the thoughts, including the things that happen that we don't want to happen, and things we want to happen and it didn't happen.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Sort of along with the Buddhist idea there of the no self.
Yeah, and
yeah.
and I think it's also very aligned in focusing.
Let's see what came for other people. There was so much to sort of for our minds to take off on.
Speak.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, just to pick up on what Roxanne was saying, I think of Jen Lynn used to talk about self without content. So this kind of like, it's not like we have no self. There is a process, but the content becomes the things we get attached to, or the ways we define ourselves as being X or Y. Even being neurodivergent could be a kind of context that we get attached to. So there's the staying in the flow of the present moment and the aliveness of the present moment. It seems to me to be, I think that's what we're both pointing to, though. I think that's what you're both pointing to.
And maybe that I could abandon the label of neurodivergent at some point, but it's very recent for me, and at this point it's a very powerful and useful idea for me to understand myself. I wouldn't say I was limited by that label. I would say that the label empowers me as a tool to understand it, just like a life preserver can be useful to you in the ocean. And then when you finally get saved, you don't want to carry the life preserver around because it's a hazard to you on the land.
Right.
But at this point, it's freeing, it's liberating at this point to
very much
accept that the fact that it's okay to be different, to be divergent.
I don't have a choice, actually.
I think that's often so true, that some kind of diagnosis or description can be so liberating, and one can say, oh, that's what it is. And then we can feel like a whole. But then when we've integrated that and it's just part of us, and we don't need to be as attached to that diagnosis or description.
Go ahead and speak, please. Feel free.
I'm thinking that you can have both. Like, I'm remembering contact improv dance experiences, being in a room of people where the object is to sense the connection between all of us and move and dance within that connection. So there isn't a written score that you have to perform to. You know, the pieces are the people themselves. So I'm imagining you, Adam, as containing, as part of the whole. Each person is part of the whole and has their content and has like their neurodivergence or their monicalness or their polyness or their Juneness, and like we have our content and we have the connection that goes through all of us. and I'm connecting with that content. Here I am connecting with your content, as well as connecting with as well as sensing the whole of the connection with everybody and with you. And here's a piece, here's some content, I'm dancing with this content and the connection. I think we can have both. We do have both.
Right. Are there other comments or questions? Questions too, if you have questions for me, I'm happy to answer them.
Yes, I have a question.
Okay.
You mentioned Feldenkrais at various points in your presentation, but never went into the details. I wonder, how can Feldenkrais help us? Or what is your experience with that?
Well, if you go to my,
interesting.
yes, if you go to my website, actually, the articles that I've written about my process and specifically are there. There's an entire article or two devoted to the exact thing that I did to improve my eyes and change my relationship with math. There's an article about my piano playing and where I broke the ice there. So I go into great detail in those articles, which were published in the journal, the Feldenkrais Journal, about that. Although I'm happy to talk about it here a little if you want.
I would like to. I have the feeling that it's happening in the body also.
Of course.
Everything. Yeah,
Yes.
that's
yes.
why I asked.
Yes. No, I mean, the big revelation was my eyes have been an interesting piece of the whole, both to the extent that I use them to understand things and to the extent that that ability to understand things through them was hampered by, for instance, this ability to scan left and right. There was a question of perception with my eyes where I saw the world very flat. I didn't have good depth perception, and that changed the way I felt about my body. I had a very flat stick of gum self-perception. And as I started to get improved depth perception, I started to feel my own depth. And that also changed beginning to think about my moving in 3 dimensions. I mean, I used to really not be able to conceive of moving in 3 dimensions. I couldn't feel it. I might be able to do it, but I didn't know what I was doing. There were certain math concepts that became available to me because I could think in 3 dimensions. You can hold this still while you move these 2 ideas. You can hold this idea. There's, a level of complexity was opened up to me mentally because the level of complexity opened up to me physically. And that's kind of the gist of the math thing. And that was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Yes.
So Feldenkrais says we act in accordance with our self-image. 3 sources: the heredity, the teaching, and our daily practice.
I'm thinking about your ideas, Adam, and Jenlin's description of another kind of concept, another way of sensing into the whole. And it seemed like that your way of solving problems is breaking them down into the pieces, which Jenlin would call the unit model, which is how we mostly do things. But then there's another element of finding the connections and finding the bodily feeling of the whole. And it felt like you were going in that direction, or wanting that. That's
yes.
Third sense, the sense in the body of this wholeness.
Yes. And the problems, I want to restate that breaking down problems has got to be done at a level that they can be perceived. It is possible to break problems down into 2 tiny elements. This happens with kids in math instruction all the time, where you try to teach them how to multiply 2 numbers and they go to sleep because you're getting down into the tiniest level of the algorithm and they never get a sense of the whole. They can't feel it in their bodies. They can't relate it to anything. So as a problem solver, you have to know exactly what that level to break down into is. If you're practicing the piano, what is reasonable in practice? Do I break it down into the notes? Do I break it into phrases? How long should I practice? That is a bigger problem to solve that helps you with the smaller problems. And that brings it in, of course, into the body, and it brings it into the awareness. What am I capable of perceiving? It's not just I do it because the book said it. What's the smallest thing I can perceive? And maybe is going to be different from someone else, like the gentleman who was able to immediately tell that the numbers were squared. Most of us weren't able to do that. I wouldn't have been able to do that if I hadn't created the problem. So, for him, that's ideal. He can go down into that level. For the others of us, we might have to solve the problem a bigger way.
And what about the leap from arithmetic to calculus to quantum mechanics?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've taken a couple of those leaps very slowly. As I said, the first leap I took was from algebra to calculus, and that was as a result of something in my body, literally understanding how you could have different kinds of variables, some which were absolutely constant, some which were constant within a range, and some which were totally free, which matches something like, the arm. Like this part of the arm can move like this. This is completely free. This doesn't move. That was mirrored in some mathematical proofs I saw. I'm not sure how people who learn quantum mechanics or higher forms of mathematics do it. You get into 4 and 5 and 6 dimensions of understanding, but I think there's some kind of, and I presented on this in Israel, actually. I talked about this when I presented in Israel. That presentation is also on my website, about movement in imaginary spaces, where you learn to move in spaces that are not real. And what that means, like you extend your body to move in places that it couldn't physically move, but you can imagine it to move. You can make crazy movements in your mind that you couldn't make in real life. And those allow you to understand problems that can't exist in the physical world. It's interesting stuff.
Yeah, and in focusing, we have those leaps. So, yes, to the breakout rooms. And
yeah, I'm thinking it's time to go in our breakout rooms. And I thought, Katerina, you were going to ask, how do we go from the leap from the problems in life to the me problem? That's sort of another leap, and maybe we might talk about that in the breakout rooms if it
and then come back soon enough so we can have Dorothy's long poem and talk
right.
about,
So we'll come back at 9:25. Okay. And thank you very much, Adam. So we'll see you all at 9:25. So, what happened in your breakout rooms? This is a time for you to share anything that came up for you.
Hello, I'm June. I'll say that Adam helped me to get in touch with my difficulty of growing up with ADD in a time when not much was known about it. And both the gifts that came with it or come with it, and also, as I said, the difficult time that came with it. And I also just loved the reminder to break things up into small pieces. That helps with my problem.
Not too small.
Thank you. Not too small. Right. Thank you, Adam. Right.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yes, I was thinking about the many clients that I've had who've had ADD or ADHD, and the discovery of that can be like, oh, that's what I was struggling with as a kid.
Yeah. Because otherwise people just tell you you're lazy. or
Charles,
lazy.
just speak.
Yeah.
All right, I'll just speak.
Oh, yes.
Well, I was sort of, I think we were kind of playing around with the fact that the me problem is always a we problem in some way.
Mm.
And the we problem sometimes is within ourselves. It could be with me and some part of me or there's some way in which I'm struggling with how I connect with the parts. So that's all, just to say that. And I think focusing always reminds us that the felt sense is always in relation with, it's always a relationship, either internally or externally. So that was one thing we were playing around with in our group.
Mm. Yeah, that I like that the me problem is always a we problem.
Very long poem today. I would like to have time to talk about it after as well.
I think Nancy had something to say. Nancy?
Yes.
I was just going to say it emphasized for me the struggle, the problem of relationships. I mean, that just feels like such a huge problem in our world today and in our families, and, you know, both in small pieces as well as in the larger global pieces. I would just love to see some solutions for that. And I think it's just going to be an ongoing, it just seems to me like an ongoing issue of picking it apart and working on it in pieces, in increments, maybe prioritizing the most important pieces. I don't know.
Thank you. And Roberta, yes.
I just wanted to say thank you, Adam, and wondering, what if we all thought of ourselves as neurodivergent?
You
know,
also,
like that was some of the things that came up in our group. We this idea that, you know, we're surprised. I mean, we're surprised. Like, what if we all thought of ourselves as being wizards? You know, that we really have like an enormous capability that we haven't even figured out yet. Like, it's the big problem with the human condition, is that we're just really kind of in a learning curve about what's possible here, you know, and how I'm so impressed with your stamina and perseverance in problem solving.
I can't take credit for it. It's just part of my neuropathy. I want to address the thing you said. I think for everybody to consider themselves neurodivergent is an opportunity, and it's also a hazard. It is true that everybody's different, but I think it's not as if everyone is different on an even grid. Some people are grouped closer together, and some people are outliers, and that detail is important, because I'm not by any means an outlier. There are some people with significant problems who need assistance and need to be considered to have significant problems in order for them to address them.
But unfortunately, we live in a world where when those people actually are in the shadows because they don't want to come out and say, I got an issue. That's true. You know, we end up finding out about them in ways because we're not identified with thinking that all of us have this, you know. So I'm just suggesting that sometimes, you know, we're believing that we're all a lot more alike than in fact I think we really are.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess,
and obviously, you know, the explosion that we're looking at in the Middle East is something that's an example of that.
Yes. Well, I would say that's the problem to solve. To what extent are people alike, and to what extent are they different, and what do we do with that?
Yeah. In in the history of psychoanalysis, people emerged, theoreticians, that were interested in one particular kind of of problem, like the schizoid personality or narcissistic character disorder. And what always happened is that the person became famous for understanding those people who had been unable to be treated in psychotherapy. And then as time went on, more and more people would read about it and say, oh, I have that too. I have that too. And so it starts very narrow, but then as you understand it, it becomes much more universal. And there's a part of all of us that is narcissistic, is a part of us that but of course that's different than having that issue in the intense way that flags it up. When it becomes more broad, it's less intense.
Well, but the example you just gave, Lynn, how about hashtag me too?
Yeah.
I mean, when all of a sudden one person speaks up and says, hey, this is happening to me, and every other person is like, whoa, wait a minute. That has also been happening to the whole world.
Yes, yes. Right.
How long it takes for us to show up and say, I got this thing. I got this thing I need to talk to you. It's like, it's kind of where we think it's our own individual, and the shame around it or whatever.
Absolutely.
That keeps you in from coming out.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So it sounds like maybe we need to hold both. The fact that some people have that a bit on this level of intensity that we could say this is a narcissistic person or this is a neurodivergent person, but that we also can hold the fact that we all are more human than otherwise, right? We all have these qualities, and we don't have to, and so we can, in a sense, be liberated and expanded instead of diminished by becoming aware of narcissism or neurodiversity or whatever. Because to the extent we all have some of that, it adds to all of us. And yet, at the same time, we need to be aware some people have it in a particularly intense way that needs to be understood. Yeah,
people have it in an intense way give us an understanding of issues or manifestations or instances that we wouldn't be aware of.
Yeah, I think it was important for me with the presentation. It was important for me because having spent my whole life assuming I was part of a big collective of people who were just like me was in fact harder because, I was of the mindset that everybody's got what I've got. Everybody's going through something. And that is true. Everybody is going through something. But for me, understanding my specific issues was very important. So I had trouble with moving. But I would never want to say that I had the same trouble moving as someone who was born with no legs and no arms. They have a specific set of challenges they've got to face, and I cannot put myself in that camp. But perhaps if I understand how they solved their problems moving, I can apply them to mine. So there is a connection there between us. We do share things in common, like a Venn diagram.
Right. I think we should have our poem so we have time for it. And
Dorothy, and then we can talk after the poem too. Yes.
What He Thought by Heather McHugh for Fabio Dopplercher. We were supposed to do a job in Italy, and full of our feeling for ourselves, our sense of being poets from America, we went from Rome to Fano, met the mayor, mulled a couple of matters over. What's cheap date, they asked us. What's that flat drink? Among Italian literati, we could recognize our counterparts, the academic, the apologist, the arrogant, the amorous, the brazen, and the glib. And there was one administrator, the conservative, in suit of regulation gray, who, like a good tour guide with measured pace and uninflected tone, narrated sights and histories the hired van hauled us past. Of all, he was most politic, at least poetic, so it seemed. Our last few days in Rome, when all but 3 of the new world bards had flown, I found a book of poems this unprepossessing one had written. It was there in the pension room, a room he'd recommended, where it must have been abandoned by the German visitor. Was there a bus of them? To whom he had inscribed and dated it a month before. I couldn't read Italian either, so I put the book back in the wardrobe's dark. We last Americans were due to leave tomorrow. For our parting evening then, our host chose something in a family restaurant, and there we sat and chatted, sat and chewed, till, sensible, it was our last big chance to be poetic, make our mark. One of us asked, "What's poetry?" It's the fruits and vegetables and marketplace of Campo del Fiore, or the statue there. Because I was the glib one, I identified the answer instantly. I didn't have to think. The truth is both. It's both, I blurted out. But that was easy. That was the easiest to say. What followed taught me something about difficulty, for our underestimated host spoke out all of a sudden with a rising passion, and he said, "The statue represents Giordano Bruno, brought to be burned in the public square because of his offense against authority, which is to say, the church. His crime was his belief the universe does not revolve around the human being. God is no fixed point or central government, but rather is poured in waves through all things. All things move. If God is not the soul itself, he is the soul of the world." Such was his heresy. The day they brought him forth to die, they feared he might incite the crowd. The man was famous for his eloquence, and so his captors placed upon his face an iron mask in which he could not speak. That's how they burned him. That is how he died, without a word, in front of everyone. And poetry? We'd all put down our forks by now to listen to the man in gray. He went on softly. Poetry is what he thought, but did not say.
Wow. That is amazing.
Well read. Thank you very much.
We have a reference to that poem in the chat that we can find it.
It will be in the presentation that I publish.
Okay.
It's hard to find, but you can do a search for it online, What He Thought by Heather McHugh, and you can find it that way. But as I said, I will include it as well. It's worth,
thank you.
Yeah, it's worth spending some time on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
I want to add that I beginning to get an understanding of why I chose this poem, but I chose it instinctively. I didn't choose it.
Mm-hmm.
in particular with something in mind, like this is why. I just went with the idea that this was the poem I wanted to share, and maybe you have ideas why I chose it.
Yeah, thanks.
Adam, when in retrospect, can you make any connections between the poem and your presentation?
Yes, I can, but wouldn't it be more interesting if you all did that first before I gave away the answers?
Well,
There's a YouTube. There's a YouTube. What by where this the reading of this poem.
Marvelous.
Anyway,
yeah. Wow.
Yeah, What He Thought by Heather McHugh, read by Neil Atkin. So
What comes up for me definitely is about being visible. I mean, that stands out. He was not able to be visible at the end, right? Being visible.
A problem not solved. Fear.
Say that again.
I said a problem not solved.
Fear.
Fear.
Solved of fear. Well, maybe we can all think about this over the week, and it's time to stop. And Adam, thank you again so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah.
I look forward to seeing this on YouTube. Bye-bye now.